Well, my clock just struck noon, and I am thrilled to welcome you to the History and Ethics of Big Data, a conversation with Iris Clever as part of our broader relationship with the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge, where she is currently a postdoctoral researcher. I am Seth Green, the Dean of the Graham School, and I am thrilled to welcome you virtually to our campus. It is a glorious day in Chicago, so I will say today is one of the days that we actually look like our postcard, and we are nonetheless inside, but looking at the grandeur from here. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Graham School, you should be. We are now 132 years into our mission of trailblazing new approaches to lifelong learning. We are a founding division of this university because when John D. Rockefeller and William Rennie Harper were setting up the University of Chicago, they wanted to ensure that the big ideas here did not just make their way to our faculty and students, but that they made their way far into the world and to learners at all ages and stages of their lives. And we remain with that mission of helping people across all ages and stages find connections to the university, better understand the world, and lead examined lives of purpose. What that looks like in tangible form is that we have 4 program areas. We have a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world. We have a basic program of liberal education for adults, which provides a foundation in Western social and political thought. We have an open enrollment catalog that keeps getting bigger and bigger, and we'll have over 70 different course options this autumn, from 3-week snackable opportunities that allow you to dip your toe in UChicago's rigorous environment to year-long and even a 4-year sequence. And then we have annual programs that allow you to engage in specific aspects of the city as well as the world, especially in the arts and culture. And with that, I'm going to take down my screen because I want you to be able to see our speaker. And so let me start with an introduction of Iris Clever. She is a historian of science, medicine, and technology whose research explores why and how science measures what it measures, a topic that could not be more important in a time of great scientific discoveries. Much of her work is concerned with the quantification of bodies, the human experience of measurement practices, and the role bodies and technologies play in defining the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity in science. Her current book project, The Lives and Afterlives of Skulls, reveals how and why biometrics emerged in the 19th and 20th century. And we are thrilled that she will be teaching a course this autumn in that larger course catalog, and I'll put it in the chat shortly. And so we'll be previewing it in our conversation today. And so Iris, let me turn to you rather than just talk about you. You are a historian of science, technology, and the body, and your research explores why and how science measures what it measures. I want to start by asking you how you came to that general premise for your research and where the examination of big data fits into that broader focus that you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Seth. And thank you, everyone, for coming here today and participating in the chat. It's really quite exciting to see where everyone is zooming in from. So my research focuses on the quantification of the human body in the modern world. And particularly, I look at how the sciences of human measurement racialize and sexualize bodies and how these practices live on today. So my work tells the histories of old data sets that we reuse today, and I show how this data is extracted in colonial contexts and then becomes shipped across oceans and analyzed and worked up in publications in famous laboratories in Europe and the United States. So the book project, which Seth already introduced, The Afterlives of Skulls, How Race Science Became a Data Science, analyzes these themes with respect to skulls. And it shows that measuring skulls with calipers is not an outdated practice, but very much lives today. It continues up until today. So to narrate this history more concretely, in 1906, a British archaeologist dug up 1,800 skulls in Egypt and sent them to a statistical laboratory in London, where they got cleaned and all sorts of workers took 30 measurements per skull. And they worked up this amount of data in complex studies that aggregated these measurements and then compared the Egyptian sample to other racial samples and fit them into narratives of primitive versus civilized races. Now, importantly, this data was reused in the 1990s to create this huge worldwide database of skull measurements. And this was created for forensic anthropology to help in identification work. So what an anthropologist does is they take measurements of a skull of unknown origin, they put these measurements into the database, and then the database compares it against this worldwide set, including the Egyptian data, and group the unknown skull accordingly. So what we see, and what the message of my book is that we see this constant reworking of old data in software today, data that has deep historical roots in racial science.
So I want to jump into that history. And I mean, this may be apparent to everyone as they hear this example of the skulls and how it begins to, look at this data with that, lens of primitive versus civilized. And I mean, I think all of us kind of have a reaction, right, where we kind of see some of this. But before jumping into the history, I just want to kind of set the table a little bit with, how does big data, including its history, influence our lives today? And essentially, before we jump into the history, why, the question of why that history matters, so to speak. So maybe we can just, spend a little bit of time kind of hearing your thoughts on that, maybe related to the, the project that you've just shared, and then we'll jump into the history and ethics of big data.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think we very much live amidst the big data revolution, and our time has also been called the age of big data, where we see this exponential accumulation of data and the accelerated development of technology that processes it. So we have machine learning applied in a wide variety of contexts, from social media to crime statistics. And we have all sorts of artificial intelligence that's being developed to seek patterns in data and create predictions. Now, this creates a ton of new opportunities, which we'll discuss, but also some problems. So think, for instance, of facial recognition technology, which has a tendency to over-identify certain populations in criminal databases. And there are several sources to this problem, pointed out by scholars across the disciplinary spectrum. So for instance, they look at the input. So how is the algorithm designed and which data is being put into the machine, if you will. And in various cases, this data itself is biased. Or they look at the output, the results of these technologies, which sometimes lead to discrimination. And I would say that historians of data go one step further. We agree that the data itself in certain cases is not neutral, and we don't quite have the skills to analyze the algorithm's design itself. But we want to point out that data is not only not neutral, but also deeply historical. So we need to go back to this long history of data collecting, which started well before the arrival of the computer. And in my case, I will point out that there is an old logic underlying big data that has roots in the 19th century, namely the idea that, and we see this today, that developers trust that both data and the technologies they built operate objectively. And thus they are rather confused by these biased outputs. So it's this tangent of objectivity and bias that has a longer history.
Well, so let's move into that history, because your course will look kind of from the kind of beginning rise, to where we are today, and then take kind of an ethical lens. And so, I'd love to start where the story, so to speak, starts. When does big data begin to emerge, and how is it influenced, based on what you've described, by existing, human biases?
Yes, that's a terrific question. As a true historian, I'll say that the answer to that is rather complex, but we should start with looking at the origins of the word data, and these are Latin in origin, where it means data means given. And it's first used in the 17th century, and it's quite common by the 18th century. And already it relates to, its meaning already relates to facts and principles. So this could be within the realm of mathematics, but also beyond. So data could mean facts from scripture. But in general, the origin of the word has to do with what is given prior to an argument. And one of the readings that we'll take a look at in the course traces the changes of meaning over time. Then secondly, the question, when do we start the origins of big data? And I think this has to do a lot with how we define data itself. And I think it's interesting to consider in this context that we already see a sense of information overload in the early modern period, where there are tons of complaints about there so-called being too many books. And this especially starts after the invention of the printing press, where there's a huge acceleration in the number of books, which leads to this perception of information overload. Now, if we take a more conventional understanding of data as numbers, I would point to my own research where in the early 20th century, we can trace the rise of mathematical statistics, a subject that various listeners today, I think, are familiar with. And this very much not developed in a vacuum, in a scientific vacuum, if you will, but within the context of biology and skull research. So if we return to the Egyptian skulls, 1,800 skulls of one sample is massive, even by today's standards. And if you then take 30 measurements per skull, that creates well over 50,000 numbers. And these numbers were processed by the statisticians in the London laboratory, where they created thousands of tables of means, standard deviations, and correlations. And very importantly, they did this by hand with calculators. And this work took them 15 years to complete. So to me, that is absolutely an example of big data, well before the computer. Now, to your question about the origins of human biases, I would say that this is present right from the start. As a historian of science, I believe that all science is inextricably connected to the world in which it is produced. This does not mean that all science is biased, but it does mean that social concerns shape scientific research and vice versa. So let me share an example from medicine that connects the past to the present. This historian, Lundy Brown, has discovered that a 19th century scientific study on lung differences between Black and white people directly shapes medical practice today. And she traces this to a single data table that was produced by a plantation physician who measured the lung function in white people and Black enslaved people, and came to this conclusion that Black people had less lung capacity. But most importantly, he was very obviously ignoring the differences in living and working conditions between his two samples. So what the historian traces is that this table travels through time and gets cited over and over and over again, up until the present, where this particular data table influences the calibration of instruments that measure lung health. And they have a race correction built into this lung functioning instrument, which still understands Black folks to have less lung capacity. And as it turns out, these race corrections are widespread in medicine, and many of them have these problematic historical roots.
Well, so you're moving us into the present, right, and showing how this shapes. And so I'm curious if you could kind of briefly describe that evolution of big data to where we are today and describe the role that you see, which you've already begun to, of big data today.
Yeah, absolutely. So keeping this brief, in the 18th century, we noticed an increasing value in quantification and precision measurements. And this is very much pushed by administrators, state officials, engineers, and traders. So what we see here is not that science decided to be more quantified and then applied that to society, but that this push for quantification very much came from society itself, and scientists then developed the tools necessary for it. So as a result of this increasing value of quantification, more and more data starts to be collected in all sorts of sources. Now, I'm interested in the body, so some examples that are relevant to me are, for instance, within a medical context, patients are being measured. Within the military context, where tons of soldiers are measured in the 19th and 20th century. And finally, within schools, tons of children are measured. Then by the early 20th century, as I mentioned earlier, we see the rise of mathematical statistics and the use of manual computers, manual calculators in several sciences. And then by the second half of the 20th century, the more widespread use of electronic computers. And then, as many of us remember, by the 1990s, various computers and the internet have entered our homes. So to bring us to the present, today, tons of people have computers and smartphones as we're communicating with each other right now, access to internet as we're communicating right now, and work with data. So data shapes our lives in so many ways. We are part of research studies. Many of us are on social media, and we are also turned into biometric data ourselves. Think about how you unlock your phone with a fingerprint or even your face, to using our biometric passports at airport security, where they scan our faces and compare that to the data that is part of your passport. And I would say, as a historian, what I very much noticed from the 18th century to the present is that there is this growing trust in quantification, in data, and in technology. There's a very persistent logic that data is powerful and objective, and this is kind of gaining steam as we move into the present. And I would actually like to, I think this is a great opportunity to invite the audience, who has already been really active in the chat, to share how big data is part of your life. How do you interact with data? We have tons of participants, so I'm sure we can think of some good examples. And while you're thinking, I'll share my own example. So I have a 6-month-old baby, and she is regularly measured at doctor's appointments where they take her height and weight. And this data is compared to this huge database on worldwide standard growth charts, which is called the WHO Child Growth Standards. And obviously, as a historian of the body and quantification, I'm very interested in this. So this is one way in which big data is part of my life. But maybe, Seth, you can also share an example.
Sure. Well, first, I'm sure that's an experience for the doctor to be, sharing that data with you and getting lots of questions from a historical perspective as well as a medical perspective. I mean, I'll share, as dean, we're looking at data a lot, and I see both sides of these, questions, in the sense that one example is we have been growing in terms of our number of courses and our enrollments, and we've been looking at how we do outreach and digital marketing. And on one level, I've been struck when we've talked with some of the people that are helping us think about it, at how they're able to kind of pinpoint who might be a natural learner for Graham and how we reach them within these very defined worlds of social media where you can put a lot of filters. On the other hand, a part of me feels, well, if we're just putting out our message and outreach to that specific an audience, our original founding mission was to make sure that we're extending the incredible assets and ideas of this university, to all learners. And so how do we think about, being targeted on one level and using data, but also not narrowing ourselves and, having that data replicate who's already found their way to our doors, versus making sure that we're constantly opening our doors wider and further, if that makes sense. So, I think that the learning I've had is just, how do you have data as context, but not as the decision making, because the decision should ultimately be based on the ethical and mission considerations, and data is just one more piece of kind of context on which you might make those. So I want to return, though, the discussion to you, and then I want to bring it to our audience. So this is my last question, just to preview it. We have some great ones already in the chat, but please start adding yours to it if you have one, so that we can make sure to get to it in our conversation. Final question is kind of the big, where do we go from here? You're a historian, I realize, but the past is often the best predictor of what's ahead. And so, how do you look at how we will navigate this world of ethical considerations in, what is an increasingly big data world that you've described, that I mean, as we look to the future, does not show any signs of stopping. And so I'm curious kind of what you see in terms of the where do we go from here, and what can history tell us about that consideration?
Yeah, I definitely have a couple suggestions there. And I want to thank the participants again for sharing their experiences of being datafied in this world, or working with data. It's really interesting to see. So yes, where do we start? Big data is constantly in the media, and it's showing huge potential. You may remember reading that there's recently been a question about whether AI is sentient, where a Google employee who was working with a chatbot had argued that it became sentient. We see tons of health data being leveraged, for instance, to study COVID outcomes or to better diagnose patients. And we might be starting a new chapter in virtual reality with the metaverse. But we also notice quite a few problems. For instance, the regulation of biometric data is a huge topic. Think of Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, which is one of the most strict rules that I think are around right now, which basically means that my family cannot post a picture of my child online without my consent. And countries like Japan, Brazil, and South Korea are set to follow suit. And India is also working on a bill for data protection from internet companies. These questions very much affect us in the US as well. Privacy has been a huge topic in post-Roe debates, where there's a significant concern about digital receipts, period tracking apps, text messages, and search histories, and how this digital data could be used against women or female identifying people as evidence of potentially breaking the law when it comes to reproductive health and decisions. So we'll see new international and national laws regulating how companies like Google, Amazon, and Meta handle our data. And this is very much a global challenge. Now, one thing that I would say is that we urgently need interdisciplinary development teams. We need to hire social scientists, philosophers, and data ethicists to have a voice in the development of these technologies and point out issues that we're trained to see. And we're not here to just point out the issues. We want to help create better technology, right? So for instance, this has already led to more inclusive databases where more people of color are enrolled or involved in the databases that teach automatic recognition technology. But there are also some roadblocks. Google, for instance, has an AI ethics team. And 2 years ago, they fired one of its employees, Timnit Gebru, when she spoke out against the company's minority hiring policy, as well as pointed out flaws in a new AI system that she was working with and said, there are some racist issues here. So we very much have a long way to go. And that brings me to my third point, where critical data scholars are skeptical of hiring more people of color in tech. This is also known as fixing the pipeline. And they say, the problems are too systemic and people are being forced out, of which, Timnit Gebru is an example. Another solution I think that is very helpful and is starting to grow more and more in the US, I see, and also outside actually, is that critical data studies is becoming more part of STEM curricula, where STEM students are not only introduced to this huge potential of big data and big data technology, but also learn to listen to what kind of problems are there, identify some of these problems themselves, and learn how to think historically and critically about data and technology, so that we can together break through this kind of persistent, powerful historical logic that quantification is objective and neutral. And then finally, I would like to point out that there are all sorts of efforts to democratize data and technology, or use data for instance, anti-racist efforts. There are community-based organizations that teach data literacy. So for instance, in Detroit, there is a digital justice coalition that teaches children how to work with tech. And here in Chicago, there are several efforts to collect data on the criminal justice system as a starting point to affect change. And I'll just finish by saying that this actually also has a very long history. W.E.B. Du Bois used statistics in the late 19th century in a hugely pioneering way to demonstrate racism against Black people in the United States. So there are some very exciting new efforts that also have long histories. Let's just leave it at that for now.
Well, so Ray Lucchesi asked our first question here, and it's about your view on whether or not the reuse of the skull measurement in the 1990s was unethical. And I know you kind of began to address that, but maybe this gives you a chance, since you've written a book on it, to go a little bit deeper into that topic.
It's an excellent question. So again, the answer is going to be complex. But what happens is that we're using kind of the tools that were developed in race science for possibly anti-racist purposes. So in itself, I would never say that this is unethical. I would say that we need to look at a case-by-case basis in which these tools are used to get a better sense of what the ethics are involved, right? So for instance, one of the things that is important to point out is that Fordisk, this particular database, is also being used in the repatriation of skulls. So for those of you who may not be familiar with this, tons of musea around the world are trying to send back the skulls that were illegitimately obtained in earlier centuries, send them back to descendant communities. And sometimes that isn't entirely clear, or in a lot of cases, we don't have data or information on where these skulls were taken from. And programs like Fordisk, who work with this old data, are actually used to then help further identify where these skulls could belong to, or who they could belong to. It's one line of reasoning that's used with a lot of other information and methods. But yeah, so that's one example in which the tools of race science are used for anti-racist purposes. So I think that that's really important to keep in mind, that, you know, obviously forensic anthropologists want to do the work of identifying missing remains. I talked to an anthropologist who works at the Field Museum here, and she says, you know, I know there are problems with Fordisk, but I just want to get someone home. And I thought that that was such a powerful thing to say. So what you see within, for instance, the forensic anthropology community, and this will be my last comment so we can move on to other questions, is that there is a big desire to really learn more about what the history can tell us about the tools that they're working with today. And what I'm trying to do with this research is show them, you know, this is one way in which history opens up some of these answers and questions for us. We're not here to shut everything down, but there's an interest to learn from this history. And this is one of the ways in which we can listen and learn some things.
Well, we have a question from Deborah Hines, and in our chat together, she suggested that she share directly because it's her story that is going to be the lead into the question. So Deborah, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Seth. Can I be heard okay? Is my audio okay?
We hear you.
In response to your interest in how data affects our lives, our own lives recently, I'm in a situation where I have hypertension, and after decades of good control, it recently went out of control. So I have several healthcare providers who are vitally interested in the numbers, the values. And I take 4 readings a day, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. This is a lot of data to manage over, and this is daily over a long period of time. So it's interesting to see how different providers want to get this data. My primary care wants the high number, the low number, and then an average. And then somebody else will scan the whole list of values. And there are there's 3 values involved here: systolic, diastolic, pulse. So this management of data has really intruded on my life for a good purpose, but nevertheless, I find the issue of how to manage this as a challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. And I'll just point out, Richard Fisher in the chat has a very similar observation here, looking actually at University of Chicago's MyChart and the table of results, and just, you know, how much information. And I think there's a similar view in his chat that, you know, this is for a good purpose, but it can be overwhelming and, you know, potentially produce anxiety. And so what does that kind of look like from a trade-off perspective? I realize you are not a medical professional, but a doctor of a different sort, Iris. But yeah, what are your thoughts as a historian looking at these topics?
Gosh, it's hard to immediately look as a historian, because I feel so much like the patient myself hearing these stories. I'm familiar with taking these hypertension readings, and I'm so sorry to hear that you're having to manage it. In my case, it was uploaded through an app in my phone, and I got a phone call if my readings were off. I also am familiar with these flags that we get on data in our MyChart accounts. For those of you who are unfamiliar with MyChart, it's the patient portal here at UChicago Medicine. And then I go to my doctor and say, well, there's this flag. What do we do? Do I need to panic? And then the doctor says, no, it's all fine. Don't worry about it. So clearly these are systems that are flagging things. And then here, I think the historian will come in a little bit. I think it just shows this really fascinating interaction between knowledge from data and expertise from doctors, because this is a tension that I very much track in my book as well, is that, you have these data folks who come in and say, everything needs to be scrapped. We need to only start measuring skulls. And then the anthropologists who've done these long trajectories in medicine, they look at a skull, they look at the body, they feel the body, and then based on vast amount of experience, make determinations as to what the race is, or in terms of health, what's going on with the patient, right? So I think you see a similar thing happening today, obviously not related to skulls, but where we have bodily readings being done by instruments that are turned into data that then are flagged in systems that have sort of standard levels. And if you're above, you're going to get a warning sign. And if you're below, you're going to get a warning sign. But then end of the day, I guess, luckily, we do have to return to our actual doctors who have this more embodied experience to get the answers that we need. So there's this weird interplay, I think, between embodied expertise and knowledge from data that can be beautifully in operation together, but it can also be kind of in conflict together.
So we have another question from Lisa Cross, and she writes, I'm learning that people of color resist providing race ethnicity data in a healthcare setting due to fear of maltreatment. And I assume she's referencing maybe anecdotal knowledge of that. When is race a construction versus a reality? I'm going to broaden the question just a little bit, which is, in one way, it's important to disaggregate data, right? Because there are sometimes different lived experiences because of the systems of injustice and discrimination. And so in one way, we need to disaggregate. In another way, you've described many points at which that race correction, leads to really adverse and problematic consequences. And so, I think just to broaden this question a little bit, how should, from your eyes as a historian, we think about, kind of how we bring an equity or racial equity or gender equity or you name the identity lens as we think about data, and how can history help to inform how we approach data with that mindset?
What a great question. I might have to think on that one a little bit. Yeah, these are such good questions. I think where I would like to start is to review and acknowledge that there's such a long history of misusing non-white peoples, enslaved peoples in science and medicine. I think the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is a huge example, has become kind of an icon for this, where Black men were enrolled in syphilis experiments without their knowledge and became sick without their knowledge. Discrimination operates also in other ways, where obviously historically non-white people have very different levels to access to healthcare, and as a result, I think of those factors, there is a resistance to healthcare in certain communities due to fear of maltreatment, as Lisa pointed out. I think the South Side Chicago is a good example, where I know anecdotally that the hospital has to do quite a lot of work to get folks engaged and come over, for instance, to get their COVID vaccines. There's a long, complicated history with the medical center and South Side. So, yeah, that's a difficult subject that I think requires a lot of knowledge of why that came to be, because of historical reasons, right? That we need to look at the history to get a better understanding of why certain communities are resistant to engage with medicine, but also science more generally. That comes up in my research as well. I feel comfortable writing about the scientists themselves and how they were wrapped up in all these racist projects. I don't feel comfortable speaking for communities that were measured that I'm not connected to, and attempt to give them voice as another white scholar. So the question how we should bring the lens of equity to data in this context is, I think, again, it's a question of getting these interdisciplinary teams together and having these conversations across disciplines to get a better sense of what are certain concerns, and most importantly, get communities themselves involved, right? Have these community-based organizations reach out and be kind of an interlocutor for it, between, for instance, the medical center here and the South Side. I know that one of my students was making a podcast episode on the vaccine distribution on the South Side last year. And there were, for instance, information sessions held at the church where people were reaching out and trying to have these conversations across communities. So that's not a perfect answer, but hopefully it gets us somewhere.
Yeah, no, very helpful. And we have another high-level question for you in the chat from Jane Protroikis. She asks, where are we in the balance between collection of enough data and a insightful analysis of the data we have? Is the current general feeling that we need more collection, or that the data we have are sufficient, but we're not where we need to be at finding patterns and correlation and bringing different lenses? And so I know that's a macro question. I'm sure that, you would need to look at individual, kind of data sets, but, in general, does it feel that we don't have enough accumulation of data today, or that the analysis that we're providing on it is not, adequate to be able to draw useful conclusions?
So I think it's a bit of both. And again, I would say that these are historical arguments. I see very much in the early 20th century, two arguments. First of all, we need more data. We need tons of it. We don't have enough. Let's get more. Doesn't matter where it comes from. Secondly, I see the argument, we need better technologies. And what we're going to do is we're going to publish all of this data, which, before computers, before internet happens in print, right? We need to publish all this data and get it out in the world so that future generations of scholars can reuse this data with better technology. So we see that absolutely happening today, right? Where scientists are going back to these historical data sets and reusing them with different technologies and, supposedly better and faster technologies. So the fact that people are pushing for this today, again, I would say is very much in line with what has been argued for decades, if not centuries. So yes, I do think this will be a case-by-case situation, but I think the people who are working with the technologies are pretty excited about it, and for good reason. And thus, they would like to have more data. And the machine learning qualities, I'm not a data scientist, but they seem incredible. It's unbelievable what's possible at this point. Going back to that language bot that was considered sentient, and we'll read about this in my course as well, is the chat between the bot and the Google scientist is just incredible, and it's based all on data. So yeah, I don't have a clear answer for you other than these are very much historical questions and historical arguments, and I do think that there is an ongoing push to collect more data and make, and if not for future purpose, when we have even more powerful technology.
Well, so we have time for one more question, Iris, and I want to segue to the class that you're going to be teaching this autumn, because this is a really kind of diffuse topic, meaning we are seeing data everywhere. It has, to your point, been hundreds of years that we have been kind of looking at this question of data, at least. How do you investigate this topic over your course? What do you read in it? How do you look at the arc of this? And, what do you hope for students who take your course that, they come away with at the end of it?
So I would love to get across the message that data is historical and data is not neutral. And I also really invite folks to participate in the class and challenge me on that. I think the most interesting conversations come out of that. And very much because I'm a historian and not a data scientist. So what we're going to review is I basically drafted 8 big questions, 8 philosophical urgent questions, and devise some readings around it. So a lot of the things that we discussed today in our conversation are part of the syllabus. And what I aim for is, besides those 2 points, is I'm a historian and I tell stories. So the main focus is on surprising stories about data that stick with you. So if you remember some of these stories, maybe a couple years later, that's going to be a win for me. So for instance, two of the things that we didn't discuss yet is there's a reading about how computers were at one point women. So the term computer was used to identify female calculators in the early 20th century. And then a second one is this book that we're going to read. It's Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, and it's a fantastic, very accessible introduction to thinking critically about data and tech. You can read this in a couple of hours, and it also reviews quite a few of the things that I've mentioned here today. So I'm dropping a link in the chat for folks. Not everyone will be able to participate in my course, but you can buy a book. And this is also hopefully in support of the Seminary Co-op bookstore, which is an independent bookstore in Hyde Park. So yeah, those are some of the readings that we're going to be talking about, some of the big questions that we're going to be talking about. And yeah, I really look forward to having these conversations, especially with folks who have very different experiences with data and very different levels of expertise coming into these conversations.
Well, I will close with a data-based argument. There is a lot of chat about how fascinating this conversation with you has been, Iris, and many people have been agreeing. So we have a significant data set that this talk was very much appreciated. And we are incredibly grateful to have you as an instructor at the Graham School this autumn. And to the many people that have asked, we will do our best to share the syllabus so that you can see what is on the docket for this autumn. And we will also, in our follow-up email, include the video and the registration link for those who are interested in taking the deep dive that was just described. Thank you all for being with us today and engaging over Zoom. It feels fitting to be using technology for the conversation of big data. And most of all, thank you, Iris, for taking the time and for being part of our team here at the Graham School. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much, Seth. And thank you, everyone. My email address is somewhere in the chat as well. If you want to reach out with any questions or comments, please do. I'd love to hear from anyone.
Bye, everyone.